Hi, let's do the last section for this chapter, saving the best for last perhaps, and this will be on RASS, the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So this is an important system, and it's all about raising blood pressure, and it's regulated by the kidneys. So all of RASS is directed at raising blood pressure. So RASS stands for renin, aldosterone, angiotensin system. It's a long-term regulation of blood pressure by the kidneys. So it's not short-term like the baroreceptor. This is long-term. Long time duration. So let's start with a stress of a drop in blood pressure. And RASS will kick in and raise the blood pressure. So a drop in blood pressure, it can be detected at a number of places. We have already talked about baroreceptors and how that stimulates sympathetic neurons. And those sympathetic neurons go lots of different places. One place that those neurons go is to the kidneys and causes the kidneys to release renin into the blood. The kidneys themselves sort of intrinsically can detect a drop in blood pressure. So the baroreceptors detect a drop in blood pressure, but the kidneys can also. The blood vessels in the kidneys are not stretched as much. The flow through the kidneys is less. We'll come back to that when we talk about the urinary system. So both places, the kidneys and the baroreceptors, detect a drop in blood pressure, and they both stimulate the kidneys to release renin. And we'll go to the next slide and look at what renin does. So remember that renin is released from the kidneys. When there's a drop in blood pressure from kidneys, when we have a decrease in blood pressure. Okay, so renin now is in the blood, and two other plasma proteins, there's several other plasma proteins. One of these is Angiotensinogen, and the ogen ending again means inactive. And again, this is made in the kidneys, or excuse me, made in the liver. Angiotensinogen is circulating in the plasma in an inactive form, and it gets converted to angiotensin 1. And it gets converted by into angiotensin 1 by renin. So renin converts that, and it acts as an enzyme. So renin is still available to catalyze the same reaction again. So renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. This is another cascade of reactions. Angiotensin 1 is in turn converted to angiotensin 2. And it gets converted by this enzyme, ACE, which again is an enzyme, so it's unchanged. And ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. ACE. It's on the endothelial walls of blood vessels. A lot of that is in the lungs, but that's not that important. What is important is that we have angiotensin 2, which I'm going to abbreviate as Ang2. And angiotensin 2 has many targets, all to raise the blood pressure. So know this little cascade. Renin is released from the kidneys with a drop in blood pressure, converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by ACE. And then we go to the next slide with lots of targets for angiotensin 2, all of which will raise the blood pressure. So, here is angiotensin 2 that we just made in the previous slide. And here are a group of targets for angiotensin 2. Remember that this whole story is to raise blood pressure. So let's start with angiotensin 2 targeting the adrenal cortex. So there are, remember, angiotensin 2 is just a protein molecule in the blood, and it travels through the blood, and the adrenal cortex has receptors for angiotensin 2. And when the adrenal cortex binds angiotensin 2, it causes the release of aldosterone. So we have an increase in aldosterone release. From the cortex. It's a steroid. And aldosterone then targets the kidneys. Remember, we're trying to raise blood pressure. So it targets the kidneys and causes the kidneys to increase reabsorption of sodium. So less sodium is going to be lost in the urine. And sodium, perhaps you remember, if not, I'll point it out now, is the primary ion that's responsible for regulating extracellular fluid. More sodium, more water retention, more blood pressure. That's the connection. So with an increase of sodium, that leads to an increase in blood volume, and that leads to an increase in blood pressure. Our old relationship of blood volume to blood pressure. So at the end of each of these pathways, I'm going to close this reflex loop, this feedback loop, by indicating that our stress has been reduced. As we started with a drop in blood pressure, here's a way to increase it. So we've closed that loop. Another target of angiotensin 2 are blood vessels, arteries, and veins. And angiotensin 2 is an incredibly strong vasoconstrictor. And you increase the squeeze on the blood vessels, and that leads to an increase in blood pressure also. Angiotensin 2 also has receptors in the brain. Specifically in the brain, there are receptors, the cardiovascular control center, and at this point you should probably be thinking on your own about what you could draw in here to raise the blood pressure. We've done this several times now. So we're in the medulla, We're going to raise the blood pressure from the cardiovascular center. If you want to pause the video, fill in your chart, check it. That would be fun. So let's go to, we'll just say that we can increase heart rate, and increase vasoconstriction. And those two will also lead to an increase in blood pressure through the cardiovascular control center. Speed up the pump and squeeze the vessels. There are also receptors in another part of the brain, the hypothalamus. And in the hypothalamus, we can have several responses. The hypothalamus is responsible for maintaining many homeostatic functions. One center in the hypothalamus is the thirst center. So that will increase our sense of thirst. We get thirsty. And that's a very strong urge to drink. And as we drink water, fluids, that will increase our blood volume. And that also will lead to an increase in blood pressure. Something to appreciate is that if you're low on fluid, the only way to replace lost fluid is to drink it. Seems a little obvious, but sometimes I think we forget that. The other thing that the hypothalamus can do is release ADH. So we would have an increased release of ADH. From the posterior pituitary. I'll abbreviate posterior pituitary as post-pit. And ADH targets kidneys. And less volume is lost, so we have less urine. And that equals increased fluid retention. And you know the connection here. That just leads to increased blood volume, which in turn leads to increased blood pressure. So I would review these different targets. We have the adrenal cortex and aldosterone, sodium, which translates into increased blood volume, and we have our blood pressure. Vascular smooth muscle is just a strong vasoconstrictor. That's pretty self-explanatory. It just cranks up the pressure through pressure on the blood. The cardiovascular control center, we've been through this one several times. That should be pretty straightforward. And the hypothalamus, increased thirst, leads to increased blood volume, drinking. And that will lead to increased blood pressure. And the hypothalamus and ADH. Again, ADH targeting the kidneys. And there is less urine. So we retain more of the blood volume, and that will help with blood pressure. So that's RASS. It's important that you have a handle on this system. It's used extensively, or you rely upon your understanding of it extensively in nursing when you're trying to treat kidney dysfunction. Many drugs work on blood pressure through the RASS system. And that takes us to our last slide. So here is a brief list of some common anti-hypertensive drugs. So these are medications that are used to treat hypertension. And see, they should start to make sense. One group are the ACE inhibitors. So you know that if you inhibit the enzyme ACE, you inhibit the production of angiotensin 2, so none of those targets that we just looked at are activated and we don't raise the blood pressure. So ACE inhibitors are a common class of blood pressure medications. There's a side note, a common side effect of ACE inhibitors is they often produce a dry, irritating cough for the patient. Some people are more susceptible to that than others. Another class of drugs are the ARBs. And ARBs stand for angiotensin receptor blockers. So in this strategy, angiotensin is still made, but we just block the receptors. We block the receptors on the adrenal cortex, can't make aldosterone or release it. Block receptors on the blood vessels so you don't get the vasoconstriction. You block receptors on the cardiovascular center and the hypothalamus, etc. Those are very common, very popular, are the ARBs. Alpha receptor antagonists. And an antagonist, you should know the difference between an antagonist and an agonist. Antagonists inhibit the receptors. Inhibit receptor. An agonist stimulates a receptor. Okay, so where are alpha receptors and how could that lower blood pressure? Well, alpha receptors were an adrenergic receptor on vascular smooth muscle. So those are alpha receptor antagonists. They block the alpha receptor, so norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system can't cause vasoconstriction. Another class are the beta blockers, and those we're talking about, the beta 1s primarily on the heart. And then we have calcium channel blockers. And the idea here is that calcium is necessary for all muscle contraction. And let's put a little remember note here from ANP1. That in skeletal muscle, where's the calcium? In skeletal muscle, the calcium is all sequestered in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the SR, inside the cell. So that is for skeletal muscle. It's all inside the SR. In smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, the calcium enters, some of it enters from the outside. There's a little bit that's in the sarcoplasmic reticulum of cardiac muscle, but for the most part, all smooth muscle, the calcium enters from the outside. So both smooth muscle, let's say smooth and cardiac muscle, rely upon calcium entry from the ECF, the extracellular fluid. And it has to come through the cell membrane through calcium channels. Well, if you block those calcium channels, you restrict the amount of calcium that enters the heart muscle, so it doesn't contract as hard. And you restrict the calcium that can enter the vascular smooth muscle, so it cannot vasoconstrict as hard, so that helps to lower blood pressure. And then diuretics. How do those work? Well, they work to decrease blood volume. It's a diuretic, so you pee more. And that translates again into lowering blood pressure. So, 6 different general classes of antihypertensive drugs that I would like you to be familiar with. So that's the end of lecture material for this 3rd chapter. There's a lot here. Practice it. Watch the lectures. Look at the learning outcomes on the Word document that I posted for this chapter. The lectures and learner should all help you with those learning objectives. So, I hope to answer questions when you have them. Take care. See you next time.